Tom Scoops Papa's Paper, Part D. The next morning, after doing my share of the morning chores, I went to the marshal's office. Uncle Mark wasn't there, but there was a prisoner in one of the cells. It was Mr. Haggerty, who got drunk every couple of weeks and disturbed the peace so much that Uncle Mark had to lock him up until he was sober. He was sitting on the bunk in his cell, holding his head in his hands. Since it was my duty as a reporter to interview all prisoners, I walked to the door of the cell. "Mr. Haggerty, why do you get drunk?" I asked. He raised his head and looked at me with bloodshot eyes. "It's that wife of mine, Sonny," he said. "She nags and nags at me until I have to get drunk or go out of my mind." I figured this was news because nobody but me and Mr. Haggerty knew why he got drunk. I made a note of it in my reporter's notebook. Friday afternoon, right after lunch, all the reporters arrived at our barn to turn in their reports. Tom sat behind his desk with his green eye shade over his eyes. He had a pencil in his hand and a big notebook on his desk. He asked me to report first. I told him what Mr. Haggerty had told me. "Very good, J.D., Tom said as he wrote in his notebook. "That is news. I've often wondered why he got drunk." One by one, Sammy, Seth, Danny, and Jimmy made their reports. All of them had one or more items that Tom considered newsworthy enough to write in his notebook. "You're next, Basil," he said. "I wait until other reporters leave," Basil said. "Some reporters," Sammy said with a sneer. "He didn't get any news." Tom had an excited look on his face as he ordered the other reporters to leave. When all of them had left the barn, he looked at Basil. "You found out something about the robbery?" he asked with excitement. "I know who robbed the bank," Basil said proudly. "I don't want to say in front of other reporters. Afraid maybe they tell it before Bugle is published." "Wow!" Tom shouted. "What a story!" Then he gripped his pencil. "Let's have it, Basil." Basil told us he was pretty downhearted by Thursday evening because he hadn't heard anything from customers at the cafe that sounded like news. He asked his father if he could stay up hiding behind the counter until the cafe closed at 9 o'clock. At first his father said no, but when Basil explained he would lose his job as a reporter on the Bugle if he didn't get some news, his father agreed. At 8:30, 2 customers entered the cafe for a late supper. They sat down at a table and ordered steaks smothered in onions and hashed brown potatoes, apple pie, and coffee. Mr. Cookavenus went into the kitchen to prepare the meal. Basil's mother was in the apartment where they lived above the cafe. Basil took a chance and peeked around the corner of the counter. He recognized Hank Williams, who had been working in the livery stable since coming to town about 3 months ago. He was a regular customer at the cafe. The other man was Frank Jackson, who had also been a regular customer in the cafe since coming to town a couple of weeks ago. His father had told him that Jackson was a gambler. Basil was about to give up when he heard the men begin to quarrel about the robbery. "I say let's take the loot and blow town," Jackson said. "Keep your voice down," William said. "The Greek is in the kitchen and can't hear us," Jackson said. "We made a bargain when I sent for you," William said. "If we pull out right away, the marshal will put 2 and 2 together and be right on our trail with a posse. But if we just stick it out for a month and then pull out, it won't attract any suspicion. We pull off a perfect robbery, and if we just stick to our bargain, we can never be arrested for it." "I guess you're right," Jackson said. "But are you sure nobody will find that valise in the livery stable?" "I've got it well hidden under some hay," William said. Basil remained behind the counter until the men had eaten and left the cafe. "Did you tell your father?" Tom asked Basil as Basil finished his story. "No," Basil answered. "Afraid Papa wants to tell Marshall." I was so excited I was trembling. "I'll go get Uncle Mark," I shouted. "You will do no such thing," Tom said, "and you will give me your word you won't breathe a word of this to anybody." "But you must tell Uncle Mark," I said. "We will tell him, but not until just before the first edition of the Bugle hits the streets tomorrow," Tom said. He dropped his pencil on the desk and began rubbing his hands. "Boy, am I going to scoop Papa's newspaper. He'll wish he'd never said I was too young to help him at the Advocate. I'll start setting the type for the first edition of the Bugle right now. You will have to do my chores this afternoon." Why should I? I asked. Because I can set type, and you can't, and we've got a newspaper to get out, Tom answered. Then he looked at Basil. You've done a great job of reporting, he said. I will see you get full credit for it in the Bugle. Now go tell all the other reporters I want them here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, but don't mention anything about the robbery being solved. I not only got stuck doing Tom's chores and mine that afternoon, but also the next morning. Tom said he'd found some typographical errors in the type he had set and wanted to correct them. I can't slug the type to make the columns come out even, he told me right after breakfast, because I haven't enough experience yet. But I can make sure there are no typographical errors. All the reporters arrived at 9 o'clock, just as I finished the chores. We all went into the barn. Tom had 2 pairs of old scissors Mom had given him. He put Sammy and Danny to work cutting strips of newspaper 7.5 inches by 10 inches. We had to wait until they had 100 sheets cut. We are ready to roll, men, Tom said. I'll turn the wheel of the press and ink the make ready. J.D., you feed the sheets into the press. Basil, you pull out the printed copies. The rest of you lay the printed copies on bales of hay and around the barn so the ink can dry. As the first copy of the Bugle came off the press and Basil handed it to Sammy, I heard Sammy yell, Holy Toledo, we solved the bank robbery! It was just like Sammy to take some of the credit and make such a commotion we had to stop the press while we all crowded around the bale of hay where the first copy lay drying. I couldn't help swelling up with pride as I read the 1-page first edition of the Bugle.